give everyone here a little bit of backstory about today. It kind of come together organically, which was really cool through conversations. Actually, it started by Shawn bringing up a great point at an event 3 or 4 months ago. Carmen following up with, "Hey, that'd be a great topic idea." And then Brian and I getting together for lunch, and he agreed. And so then we were like, "We'll have all three of you guys do a panel." And we had an intro call, and as luck would have it, all three had a very different perspective and opinion on this. And I was like, well, that could be fun, a little bit of a heated discussion on which one's right, when in the reality they're all right, depending on the circumstance. So what I'd like to do is we're going to break this down into really two parts. So the first part, I'm going to give Brian, Shawn, and Carmen the opportunity to set the stage really for kind of their opinions and their perspectives. And in doing so, they're going to speak to their company, the little bit of details about who their company is, what their company does, and their approach to team distribution pre-pandemic. And so once all three have the opportunity to do that, we'll dive into the challenges they faced during the pandemic and really what was the driver behind them pivoting or not pivoting, and what their advantages were for doing so. So I'll start on my screen left to right, which is Brian, Shawn, Carmen. So Brian, if you don't mind, dive in and give us a little bit of backstory about StrataSan and really what pre-pandemic looked like for you from a leadership perspective.
I suppose I should unmute first. Yeah, so I can dive into that a little bit. Hi, for those that don't know me, I'm Brian Dailey. I'm the CTO and co-founder of StrataSan. I've been with the company a little over 10 years now. Started out as an engineer, leading engineer teams, and now kind of manage the product delivery side of things. So pre-pandemic, we were actually in an office in front of the Capitol building in downtown Nashville. We could, almost throw a rock and hit the state capitol. Our office had about I'd say 50 people in it, and we were busting at the seams as far as room for people goes. There was a issue with parking, that sort of thing. We were actually looking in March to sign a new lease to size up, and we had, I would say, 4 people working remote at that time. So we had some folks that were distributed, but predominantly in the office. Some of the teams would work from home once a week, so we were already used to working remote, but the office was the nexus. And as I mentioned, we were looking to actually expand and got very close prior to the pandemic to signing a new lease. For those that are not familiar with Nashville, a tornado came through town in early March, and that actually killed our internet from the office. We were all working from home in early March, and then in mid-March, when the pandemic really got going, I think Tom Hanks got sick and the NBA canceled some games. That's when everyone was like, oh crap, this is a real deal. Let's all work from home. So we took all of our laptops and picked up and started working from home. And the transition for us was pretty smooth because we were already set up to work from home. A lot of employees did, like I mentioned, at least once a week. So it wasn't too painful. But at first it was temporary. But as time kind of went on, and just kind of some background on my company, we do healthcare market research. So we have a team of engineers. We have a product that's kind of a SaaS enterprise type thing. And a sales force, kind of technology. So think technology company. So everyone went home with the assumption that we would be coming back. But as weeks progressed, we needed some certainty because, as weeks went into months, it was a question of, are we coming back? Because those that were not coming back were asking about, I'm thinking about moving, maybe moving out of town. They were making life-impacting decisions, and we wanted to give some level of confidence to our employees about what's going to happen here long term. It's very difficult for us to know when we would be able to come back. So ultimately, we looked at our options and decided to make the call of going intentionally fully distributed. We spent a lot of time talking to other companies who had pre-pandemic been fully distributed, companies like HashiCorp, GitLab, and a few others that we reached out to and talked to engineers to ask, what was working for them, what kind of documentation. GitLab in particular had a lot of stuff already online. So we tried to be intentional about it, knowing the trade-offs, but ultimately made this decision to go fully distributed. And so we've been operating under that assumption since. Anything else you want me to cover before we move on to Shawn?
I believe that's a pretty suitable starting point. Shawn, you want to dive in?
Sure. I have really two stories to share because I'm one of those people who did a mid-pandemic move from one company to another. So my first experience was at a company called Envision Healthcare. You may be more familiar with AmSurge, which is more kind of the local branding, local office. And we were very early in the decision to go remote. A lot of that being that Envision does a ton of emergency room hospital staffing. And so we knew really early on how bad this thing was going to get. So I think we were probably one of the first companies that bailed on the office and sent everybody home, which was kind of a coordinated disaster in some ways because we did not have a large distributed workforce. Working remotely was a new thing and created a ton of new and interesting headaches because we had not gone through that deliberate process like Brian's team was able to do. So we did get things back up and running, got to a place where folks were reasonably productive, and eventually kind of actually crested that point where I think we could actually say objectively that individual productivity had begun to surpass what it was pre-pandemic, all in the office levels. For reasons totally independent of that, I was recruited to go work for a startup here in Nashville, formerly Axial Healthcare, now Wayspring. They as well had a pre-pandemic office in Cummins Station, and everybody worked out of that office. That was a kind of a core central hub for them. And they had to also navigate the challenges of going to the remote workforce from there. Wayspring in particular had a really interesting challenge too, because it was in the middle of pivoting its business model. In fact, we still are in the middle of pivoting our business model from a legacy offering that we had done for the first kind of 10 years of our existence to a new offering that is just now coming online in the last 6 months. And so as we were trying to approach that new offering, we continue to run into what I'd consider just be coordination bottlenecks that came from the remote situation that we found ourselves in. A lot of those kind of drive-by conversations, whiteboard conversations that we needed to have happen to move quickly weren't really taking place the way that the leadership team or really any of us wanted to. And so we had the first opportunity to come back post vaccines. We jumped at it and brought back in as many folks as we could into the central office at Cummins Station. Delta threw a wrench in that. We had about a 6-week period where everybody kind of bailed again and slowly came back in. But definitely the center of gravity has remained there. During that time, though, we acquired a ton of people who were completely remote, people who worked in North Carolina, people who worked in New York State, and Indiana, and Kentucky, and East Tennessee, West Tennessee. All of that complicated this return to office because now we had some permanent remote folks who couldn't be expected to come in, as well as a group of especially engineers and software developers who really grown to prefer the remote work environment for the majority of their week. So what we've been working through is a partial in-office, a hybrid in-office, depending upon a person's role, a person's seniority. Generally, people who are more senior expected to be in the office more often for more coordination, but where pretty much everyone is expected to have some time in office and really have been working through what does that look like? Who do we bring in? When do we bring them in? For how long? In fact, this week, we're going to be doing our first company-wide, everybody flies into Nashville to get to go meet and be with each other meeting. So we're actually going to do a very early holiday party on Thursday. So we will have more people than have ever been in the Cummins Station office on Thursday, which would be really interesting to see how that plays out. But it's been a really interesting ride to go through as we've tried to navigate that I wouldn't say that need, but that opportunity for what the in-person experience brings, along with the reality that a lot of folks have become very used to the work from home, and a lot of people are just going to be physically remote in a way that it is, we can get a week for them to fly in and be, on site, but for 3 weeks out of the month, they're going to be back in Indiana or wherever they happen to be from, and trying to make the best use of everyone's energy around that space. So it's been an interesting situation to navigate, and hopefully we can kind of share some insights from what we've experienced there.
Awesome. Thanks, Shawn. Awesome. Carmen, you're up.
Yeah. So I work for eMIDS, which is a healthcare provider solutions provider. We essentially build idea to scale software that is usable, all right, useful for practitioners, usable for healthcare consumers, and highly marketable for healthcare companies. That's sort of our tagline. That being said, that work is predominantly meant to be in person, right? It really, we were on site with our clients in their facilities, really partnering side by side every day with clients pre-pandemic. Needless to say, when the pandemic hit, a lot changed for us. And because we're a global company, I think it's been really interesting to see the effect it has had well beyond just in the United States, but in all of our global regions as well, because it's been a bit different. And so solutioning for different regional sites has been quite challenging. My other job is I own my own company. It's a performance care company where I partner with leaders to really help them understand what it takes to build high performing teams. So it's really been interesting in this realm to really work with leaders, both here at eMeds and externally, on how we do solve for this new revisioning of how work will get done and where work will get done. So we've taken a couple of different slices at it. Again, a lot of our contracts actually mandated, right, that we will be in office, in surveillance facilities for security reasons and just because of the sensitivity of a lot of the roles that we're in. So that was kind of the first hurdle that we really had to partner with our clients on to kind of understand how are we going to co-solve for this, right? Like this is a big problem. There's policies and security procedures in place for a reason. Fortunately, you know, there are technology solutions that really helped us solve for a lot of those. And that became a hurdle that, quite frankly, I think, you know, a year ago, we would not have seen possible to overcome. And now just really isn't a hurdle. In fact, now it's, you know, we're facing a lot of the issues that everybody else has already talked about, in that our employees have gotten very comfortable working from home and doing the work that they want. And so we're sort of waiting to hear, and there goes my light, waiting to hear whether or not we will have to move back in office, or whether we will just be able to continue doing, you know, what we're doing now. So we have put the expectation out there that we will most likely move back in office. But we're going to do a role-based approach is really what we think of it on. And I'll talk quite a bit more about that when we get into it. But when we think about roles that must be in office, roles that can be in office or should be in office, and then roles that have no reason to be in office. And so what do those look like? And how do we make that the most effective model it can be for our clients and for ourselves?
Thank you, Carmen. So what we'll do now is we'll start back with Brian. So now that we have kind of a fundamental understanding of kind of challenges during the pandemic, now we get to the meat of the presentation and the meat of the content, and we'll allow them to dive into how they address those challenges, what challenges arose from those, the advantages of their pivot. So what I'd like to do, once each one is done, we could open it up to questions specifically to their situation and to their environment, and then we'll move on just like we did before. So Brian, if you want.
All right, so let's dive into a little bit. So I'm kind of coming at it from what has our experience been, what are we learning from it, what are the advantages that I see of it, what are the disadvantages, and where do I think this is headed ultimately. So we've been doing distributed now since March, and we've gotten more intentional about it, I would say, in July. Some of the advantages that we're seeing, and it's getting more advantageous as time goes on, is recruiting. Immediately, we were able to pull employees from competitors, direct competitors with Stratasan in other cities that would not have considered moving. They were embedded in the cities they were living in, Chicago, Boston, and elsewhere, and had no intention of moving. Originally, we would have requested that they move to Nashville, but once we were able to open that up to a remote setting, they were more amenable to joining us. I'm also seeing on the engineering front, companies that are requiring folks to come back into the office. Those folks are looking for work. And so we've had a lot of screening conversations where a common question we ask is, why are you looking? You sound like you're pretty happy where you're at. Well, I'm looking because I'm being asked to come into the office 3 days a week now. And that traffic in Nashville is not terrible, but if you live in a city like Houston or Alabama or Dallas, that can be 3 hours of your day. And once you've gotten used to having those 3 hours back, it's really hard to claw that back and think about, spending that time in traffic. Excuse me. One of the advantages of being distributed is your cat wants to hang out with you too. So recruiting has, we're able to hire, and I mean, Shawn, you mentioned this, you're able to hire outside of Nashville. We've hired 38 people since March of 2020, and I would say 90% of those have been outside of Nashville. We're able to find talent wherever it is. Some are in Middle Tennessee just because that's where our networks are. But being able to open that up countrywide has been a big game changer for us. There's an interesting cultural effect that going distributed has, and there's trade-offs. Obviously, every decision has trade-offs. One of the things that we've seen that is kind of hard to quantify is that being distributed has a democratizing effect on kind of culture. And what I mean by that is when you are in a group like this, everyone's a square, the same size. And when you are in a room with a bunch of folks, senior people tend to have a lot more weight, whether they realize it or not, with what they say. They're given more of an opportunity to speak. And that's true of just personality types as well. People who are more charismatic tend to dominate discussions. See a lot less of that in a distributed environment. There's maybe some trade-offs on that, but that I think is an interesting observation that we've seen over the last year. So what are kind of the downsides that we've seen? This wasn't even on my list, but one of the things Carmen mentioned was contracts that required people to be on site. We're in healthcare, so we're under a regulatory scheme with HIPAA as well. And some of the contracts that have gotten put in front of us, require a disaster recovery plan for everywhere personnel is situated. And we've had to go back and revisit those, right? Like, well, that doesn't make sense in a distributed environment. We don't need an office disaster recovery plan. It's more about, how do you get your machines and make sure you have internet. Things that are mission critical, let's address those. Let's not talk about where people are getting the work done. Let's make sure that the value that we're delivering is not interrupted. So security and compliance can be a challenge. But the biggest thing about distributed is that humans have evolved for in-person communication. Everything about us is centered on being able to sit in front of another person, meet them eye to eye. And this is a new thing where we're, not making eye contact. Most people don't look into the camera. You're not building that sense of camaraderie and team work that happens in an in-person environment. It's hard to recreate that distributed. And I think that if you're going to go distributed, you have to face that fact head on. I will say that distributed in a pandemic is different than distributed normally should be. Those things shouldn't be conflated. Obviously in a pandemic, we weren't able to get people together. A week ago, we actually had our first company town hall, and all but about a dozen came and visited in person. And it was a huge engagement boost / energizing, just to see people, talk to them in person. And it's something that we plan on doing on at least a quarterly basis, maybe having more often departmental type things. But travel, is going to be necessary because you want to be able to build those connections that are very difficult to create in a virtual environment, and kind of build those bonds. The other thing is team silos. When you move, and this is a study Microsoft did with their remote stuff, so this is not something unique to Stratascan. I think there's a lot of data to back this up. When you go distributed, silos become more siloed. So if you aren't making an intentional effort to encourage cross-team communication, you're going to find yourself cut off from the rest of the company. So, that you've got to come up with strategies to kind of combat that. We've created a few different methods for that, kind of building cross-departmental touch points on a regular basis, I don't think it's insurmountable, but it is a challenge to be aware of. One of the things that we've implemented, if you're in a distributed environment, all your meetings tend to be transactional. I need something from you, or you need something from me. So you lose the kind of serendipitous coffee pot interaction where someone says, hey, you know, what are you working on? And they describe it. Oh yeah, I know a thing about that, and contribute to it. That doesn't happen in a distributed environment. So we set up a tool called Donut that connects people pairs across the company, across departments, and allows them to talk for, this is a weekly thing, for 30 minutes. And it's usually non-work related things, but that's kind of helped encourage cross-team communication. Yes, it's not the same. It can't be the same, but it does help. And those that have participated, entirely optional, have found that it's helped them to get to know, kind of build those weak ties across departments that wouldn't otherwise exist. It's helpful if you've already had a conversation about that person, you know, their family, you know, they have kids, their dog's name, whatever. That's helpful. So let me just kind of recap what I've talked about here. Advantages: recruiting, dropping in commute time. I think that the trend, if we want to talk about the trend, is this is where things are going. There's going to be exceptions to that rule in situations where it can't be the case, in highly regulatory environment where security is a more physical, you know, if you're not in the cloud, you actually have physical things that you need to keep secure and protected. That's going to be challenging. But this is not going to stop. The train has left the station. This is where things are going. And if companies are not going to adapt, those that have adapted will have a competitive advantage in the recruiting sphere, as well as just competitive advantage from a cost perspective. You know, if you're able to hire anywhere, that kind of flattens the playing field as far as salary. So advantages: recruiting, commute time, cats, dogs, you get to hang out with them on a regular basis. That's an advantage. Disadvantages, you know, communication. That's the big thing, and figuring out how to make that an acceptable trade-off. Happy to talk more about that. I will throw out that I saw a 2021 fall survey from a recruiting firm, Ripple Match, that said that 2/3 of Gen Z is prioritizing indefinitely staying remote. So it's a generational thing too. So when I say it's coming, both from a generational and an industry perspective, this thing is moving. It's going to keep going. I expect it to continue growing in proportion to the people who are employed. I'll hand it off to Shawn.
We can ask some questions. I have one specifically, Brian, if that's okay. So when you're talking about hiring remote employees, I'm curious to know your guys' approach. You mentioned that you baseline really the salary issue competing. So how does that work if you're hiring someone, let's say from New York, who has a higher cost of living, and how do you gauge that? Is there like a rate, you know, an equation that you plug in, or do you guys offer the same regardless, or how does that work, if you don't mind speaking to that?
Yeah, so we're still small enough that we're kind of more flexible in that regard. There's not a cut and dry methodology for us to approach that yet. I could see that becoming something we would have to get more intentional on as time goes by. But when we're interviewing, and at least my department, I can't speak for the entire company, we're often asking, you know, what do you want to get paid? And that's just one of the criteria that we're measuring when we're looking at who we're going to hire for a role. You know, total cost, what talent are you bringing? Is it worth paying the extra based on the value that you're going to bring to the company? The value that you create at Stratascan is what's going to drive your salary, not your location. Period.
Very interesting. And I have one more question too, and we'll open it up to anyone else that may have some questions. So when you're talking about a distributed team, what is your, I guess, what are your best practices around efficacy of your team? Like, how do you make sure everyone's doing what they say they're doing?
Yeah.
How do you encourage them, motivate them as a leader? What tools do you use to gauge that? Curious to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I had this circle, but I didn't want to take up too much time, so I didn't jump into that at all. If you're remote, obviously metrics are even more critical. That said, if you're operating in a co-located situation, metrics are still critical, because the appearance of work in person can be deceiving, right? People can be in the office for a long time and not getting anything done. I will say this was a concern that we had from some of our investors, frankly, when we made the decision to go remote. There were some reservations. Look, we know what you're doing. We're going to go ahead, but how do you know people aren't hiding, and not getting things done and not contributing? Well, that's a management problem. It's also a measurement problem. So let's make sure that we have clear KPIs for each team member, for each team, to make sure that we're making progress. And we had already kind of started that initiative prior to going remote. We use a kind of a system based on a book called Traction. It's EOS, Entrepreneurial Operating System. And we've done this for a long time, where you have a weekly scorecard that you're looking at teams. And so that can be challenging for a development team, right? You don't want to measure something that doesn't matter, like lines of code. You want to go, number of issues closed, velocity. There's a lot of different ways to look at that. But having a pulse on all of that is critical. You've got to have some way to measure output, make sure you're hitting the things that you want to hit. So yeah, we do that as part of it. We kind of keep a scorecard that's updated on a weekly basis to answer the underlying question.
Awesome. Any other questions for Brian from the group before we hand the virtual mic to Shawn? All right, Shawn, you're up.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Brian. That's the great perspective. And we've seen a lot of those same things that you're describing about the virtual environment, especially for the folks who are fully remote, the folks who have a more remote focused workforce or portion of their work. A lot of the decisions for us, though, have also been around that balancing of time between the in-office and the remote portion of it. I think it's probably helpful to revisit some of the why behind for us on bringing people back into the office. And also, like I said, we're in a hybrid environment. And my company right now is in build mode for a new product. So up to this point, Wayspring had primarily provided analytics and metrics on opioid use and opioid prescribing providers. And we're pivoting to actually trying to help people who have an opioid use disorder or another substance use disorder directly, like a direct to member inside of an insurance plan approach to helping people overcome those addictions and other things that they're struggling with. So in that total reboot of our business model, we didn't have a lot of those kind of steady state things in play. And in fact, our team that is doing the legacy product has remained more remote because their work is more consistent over time. They know what their metrics are. They know what their operating expectations are. A lot of those folks were remote to begin with because they're actually in the same regions and markets of the providers that they were servicing. For those of us who did come back in, though, the focus was how do we actually build a product together, and how do we build a thing where we've got to have cross-functional groups of not just the coders and developers and analytics and back-end engineering, but also the people who are actively working with our substance use disorder members, the people who are selling this new product to insurance plans. How do we kind of tie the loop together for all of those? And so for the folks who had more of an emphasis on this new product, there's been more emphasis on coming into the office and coming into shared spaces together. And so that has meant for some of our remote folks, especially the leadership roles that we hired, that we have been flying them in to Nashville to go spend time in the office to help develop and build out many of these new products. And we found that there's been a ton of value to come from that. I think there is still nothing like a whiteboarding session where you just get 3 or 4 smart people in a room with different disciplines. And I don't know if it's something about the vapors from the Sharpie or the vapors from the Expo markers, or just that kind of that interaction, that energy that comes from it. But there's just a ton you can get done in a short amount of time when you have those folks brought together into one place. And I have noticed that our development sessions where we have to be remote because someone isn't able to travel in a particular day tend to be less productive in terms of the quality of the requirements that we gather from that and the amount of time that it takes us to turn around and get the product to where it needs to be. So that's been driving a lot of those decisions. It's also meant that the balance of people coming into the office is much more focused on senior positions, on manager positions, or on unique positions. So we just hired our first medical coder. That's a person who's probably going to be coming on site a fair bit because she has a very unique skill set and knowledge set that no one else has. We've brought in some of our first hires in the licensed clinical therapist space have come in on site to help out with understanding what is it that a person who has a substance use disorder needs? Like, what are their specific, very real material needs in those moments? And I think that has helped us quite a bit. The engineering staff have stayed largely remote. We have, I think we've got 1 to 2 days as requirements for most of those folks to come in. And we have been really intentional about trying to make sure that those are days where they're going to be overlapping with someone for something like a whiteboarding session or feedback on a product that's been delivered. So that's been, I think, really key to us as well, is that for the folks who do have some on-site expectations, that it's not just you've got to come into the office because you're occupying a seat proves that you're productive. That never really worked before the pandemic, but I think through the pandemic, we really proved that model of measuring productivity by butts in chair time is not, it was never effective, but was really proved to be completely bankrupt during the pandemic. But I think there's also a respect factor that comes with it too, that if I'm going to ask you to drive in or fly in or be physically present, there's got to be a really good reason for that. And that reason needs to be communicated to that person of, yes, I'm asking you to commute in today, and it's because I want you to meet with these people and I want you to achieve this objective. And then what's nice about that too is that on the backside of it, once they've achieved that objective, if you leave at 2:30 in the afternoon, great, go home, be productive, skip the rush hour. It makes it really clear why someone has to be there, and also when they're valuable, when their time is valuable there and when it isn't. And so that's allowed us to be flexible even within the days that people are coming in to choose that time of, yeah, I'm here for an afternoon full of meetings, so I showed up after lunch. Great. That's when you should be here. That's when your time is valuable to be here. Instead of having that expectation of it's your day in the office and it's 8:30. Why isn't your rear end in a chair? Because I don't need to be here. I'm not adding value in this moment. I think that's really helped us with that transition, and especially for the engineering folks to have that appreciation for here's why you're here. Here's what value comes from you being present. Now that said, we have lost some people through that because they decided they wanted to stay fully remote. Other people had family situations change where transition to remote would have been preferable, and they've taken other positions. So we have seen turnover as a result of the decisions that we've made. On balance, though, I think we've probably moved forward faster as a result of having that combined time in person. But it has created some problems as well. And I think, as Brian pointed out, you have in-person has the problem that the senior most person is the most important person in the room, and everybody tends to defer to that. The extroverts tend to get all of the oxygen in the room. If you layer on top of that dynamic a in-person versus remote person inside of the same meeting, almost all the gravity shifts toward the in-person. And so those people who are attending remotely tend to have very little participation, much less input into the process. And there really is an intense gravity there. And that takes place in all the ways that you'd expect, right? Side conversations that are happening in the physical space that can't be participated in for the people who are outside of that. And even more subversive behaviors like going on mute to talk about something while everybody else is on the call. And that those sort of things we've had to be really mindful of reminding ourselves, no, there are other people here and they need to participate fully in this moment in order for this to be valuable. And so that's required some degree of, I don't call it policing, but I mean, in a way, kind of self-policing to make sure that we're mindful of those folks. And also the recognition that the people who are remote fully are probably not going to be as visible in general, and may have to accept some sacrifices and limitations to advancement as a result of that. That's certainly a piece that we are having to deal with as people come in right now, not just a ton of it because most everybody's fairly new, but we're anticipating that probably 2 years down the road, somebody's been in a role for a couple of years, maybe looking for advancement, and maybe watching as peers who are physically located in Nashville advance more quickly. So it's certainly something that I don't know that we have a good way to deal with that yet, but it's something that's kind of on my future cast of things to worry about. That's something to be mindful of as well. Also have found that there's nothing like stand-up times each day to get a team together to really try to cement some of those social ties. So rather than doing I think donut was the one Brian mentioned, we've just been trying to be really intentional about having some business time mixed with some non-business time to get everybody engaged together as a way to try to keep the team cohesive and together. So it's something I practiced before going to a hybrid setup, and definitely something that worked out really well during the pandemic when we were fully remote. It's something I think I probably will continue to do indefinitely, just because that creates a lot of social cohesion within a team. But yeah, I think in general, our experience has been positive with hybrid, even given those limitations, because it has allowed us to still recruit for some of those folks who have a remote expectation, and grow our team more quickly than if we had been totally focused on, you must be here in person in Nashville in order to join the company. But it certainly will present some challenges as we go forward for the folks, probably more so for the folks who are primarily remote.
Shawn, let me ask you to, Brian brought up earlier the importance of cross-departmental rapport. You mentioned team daily stand-ups. What do you guys do at Wayspring to, I guess, foster cross-departmental? Do y'all do the same thing? Do you encourage, especially for the remote workers, to reach out to someone across in a different department to do a stand-up, or do you guys have kind of a curriculum or a protocol in place to ensure that different departments are communicating and building that rapport appropriately?
So the rapport building's been a little bit more at the manager level, trying to make sure that, and we tend to be in the office more, but trying to create more of those connections at the manager level. I tend to encourage my team to do direct reach outs to people in other departments, and especially when we're doing product delivery or presentations, encouraging them to be the ones presenting the product, so that they get some face time in front of the group, so they're not just the completely behind the scenes people, but you can actually see, oh yeah, Alex produced this particular dashboard, and this is what went into it. And Kurt did this thing over here that this list that you're working down as a work queue. I found that that's been really helpful for them to get that face time in, even though they tend to be more remote. Their expectations are just 2 days a week in the office. And that's given them more visibility, and I think helped create some more social connections there. But then as well, another piece that we've done to really try to encourage the kind of full cross-pollination across levels is, at least for the people who are here in Nashville, we do have a team lunch every Wednesday. So encourage everybody to come in on Wednesday. It's kind of the one day that, between a little bit of a push of, hey, I think you should be here, and a pull of, hey, there's free food, tends to pull people into the office. There is no gravitational force more powerful than free food, I've found, for pulling people in. But that doesn't solve for the folks who are completely remote. In fact, we actually had one person who, of her own accord, moved to Nashville from Buffalo because she wanted to be more part of what was going on with the team. So she'd been hired as a fully remote person, and she actually decided, one, Nashville's cool. Two, I feel like a lot of things are happening here. I think I just need to come into town, and the team lunches have been actually really good for her. She's mentioned that she felt like she really was missing out, or now that she realizes how much happened at those team lunches, she's realizing how much she had missed out beforehand, and is thankful to be here now. But again, that gets into some of the tension that we're probably going to experience going forward, of kind of a two-tier system of people who are fully engaged, and live in Nashville, and the folks who are more fully remote and only come in at odd times for quarterly meetings and such.
Thank you. That was a very, very thorough answer. Opening up to the other attendees. Anyone have any questions for Shawn specifically?
I really like your observation about this trend is making it so that we're more respectful of people's time that it takes to come into the office. I think that was probably discounted prior to this whole thing. And saying, like, we need a legitimate reason, like it has to be justifiable for you to take time out of your day. And I think that's a great observation.
It's a huge paradigm shift, because the assumption beforehand had just been, well, of course you come into the office.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Just take it for granted. Yeah.
I'm sorry you don't live, in downtown Nashville. What do your hour and a half long commute is your problem, right?
Right.
Which I had that conversation with a couple of employees many years pre-pandemic, and we had a very interesting discussion about rents in different parts of the city and how much we were paying. That was that was a painful conversation to go through. Where it was like, yeah, you're paying me X and rent is Y, and so yeah, it is an hour and a half, and that is kind of your fault.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. Okay, Carmen.
Yeah. So I think, with our model, I agree with everything Brian and Shawn have said. Great point. We are asking people to come in when they can, but I think I'll probably piggyback off of Shawn and the last theme but it needs to be valuable time spent, right? So the reasons for coming in are not to do your day-to-day work. We really have kind of taken a step back and looked at where are we at high risk, where is the work very unpredictable, and then where are we just more operational, right? I mentioned before about our role-based play on it. And where we have long-standing, ongoing, similar, predictable type work, we've basically classified those roles as able to do work where they can for now until something might change in policy or contract or things like that, meaning from an external pressure. But internally, and really what's really funny is since the four of us actually met, we've had more changes, right? Like the spikes go up, the spikes go down, talent acquisition is difficult. Clearly in our industry, our biggest issue is retention, without a doubt. And I do think we're going to continue to see that, because I do think that like type personalities will attract. And so if you are a company like ours who's really kind of pressuring people to be in office, we're probably going to continue to do this turnover until we find our people, right, that want to be in office and that really want, sort of the co-location work. They are out there. I do think we hear all the time about, the people that are excited and want to stay permanently remote. But there are a lot of people who don't. A lot of the extroverts, a lot of just people who I'm clearly one of them, right? I get energy from other people. I could work from home more than I do. It's convenient from the standpoint of I have a family I have to take care of. I have a house I have to take, I've got a lot of personal things I need to do. So that standpoint of being able to manage all of that while still figure out where to get my work done anywhere is super convenient. But I'm at my best in person. I just am. I know that about myself. So some of the other challenges that it has really brought upon us is self-discipline, right? I've never been a huge fan of EQ. I get it and I understand why it's out there, but emotional intelligence really has become, I think, a big part of recognizing and being self-aware and self-managing. Now that we're in such distributed models, it's more important than ever. And I think it does require leaders to take a bit of a step back to help your team members understand what is it that they need. How can they be really productive remote workers? It isn't always just about getting your work done, but like when I'm partnering with other leaders, I'm sorry, one more time, maybe? Okay. When I'm partnering with other leaders, I talk to them a lot about how do you feel when you come out of meetings, right? And I have all ends of the spectrum, but I do have a group where they're just exhausted at the end of meetings versus me, right? Like I'm energized at the end of meetings. So I always want to say, well, then you need to be aware of that and you need to self-manage. And if that means you need to block off 30 minutes after a meeting so you can reset, recharge, take a walk around, whatever you need to do, you need to do that for yourself. And so as leaders, I think we need to give them space to understand they're going to have to figure out new means of coping with this dynamic, resetting, recharging, because they are accountable to showing up for work at their best, no matter where they are. But I do think as leaders in this new, leading through all of this, we have to help them. We have to give them hints and cues and tools and resources with which to work. I am going to kind of jump us to one of the other questions we asked was, what about new innovation, new tools, new technologies you may have used? I don't know that these are all that great, but Owl is an amazing camera platform. I don't know if you've used before, so when we did come in office, we were all sitting 6 feet apart. And so when you're trying to get everybody on a Zoom camera to see, it's really hard. Owl is a cool little technology that will turn the camera, and it can either slice the room and everyone's in a frame as if you were all on Zoom together, or it can speak, flip to the person speaking, which we've had that technology for a while, but it's pretty unique from what I've seen of a lot of the cameras I've used, and we've been using it in conference rooms, and we actually got it from clients. We saw a client doing it on a Zoom with us, and we were really excited that we could see all of them in the room as if they weren't in the same room together, right? It was really interesting. So that's just one technology. And then I know it's been out for a while. I think it's changed names a couple of times. At the moment, Microsoft is calling it Viva Insights. I was pretty skeptical about it in the beginning, but all it is what we've all talked about, right? It uses the data, it uses our behaviors, it uses what we do and provides back insights into how we're using our time. It's actually pretty interesting because you can tell yourself you're being really productive. You can tell yourself, well, I was getting asked the questions, how many people did I meet with this week? Which was just more or less, am I getting out there? Am I making sure? And I'm like, I have no idea. Oh, but Viva does, right? Viva can tell you how many unique interactions you've had. And an interaction is more than one thing. You can't just send a cold email and that count. It has to be a conversation back and forth. So it's multiple email threads, multiple teams. So Teams is connected to it, right? Because again, it's Microsoft. It doesn't connect to my phone, so I can't, like, calls or text won't fall into that. But there was a time where I had interacted with 93 unique people, and I was like, holy cow! Like, to me, I thought that was a whole lot. I'm like, I feel like that's a lot. So maybe that's too many. Maybe that, but I think there are just lots of different ways now and tools out there. And I'm not suggesting go buy either of these. I'm just simply pointing out they're out there and they're probably already embedded somewhere in the tools that you're using. I'm sure, if you're on a Gmail thing, I have to believe Google's got something that competes with Microsoft Viva. I have to believe Slack's got something, like they all will have these new analytic type modules now. And I caution you, like, we don't want to get, totally wrapped around the axle, but it does every once in a while just give you, when you talk about how can I tell if my team members are engaged when they're fully distributed, having some insights into how many conversations are they having in teams, how often, how many people are they interacting with. I think those are interesting angles for us from just a health standpoint, right? Like, how healthy is my team today? I think we all know lots of great ways to figure out, are they doing the work? But when we talk about retention and we talk about engagement, it's far beyond that, right? Like, how do we know if we're about to lose a really good person? I think a lot of that has to do with how many touch points are they making a week, how engaged are they, how active are they, and just really starting, there's lots of different ways that you can go about that. The only other thing I think better than free food to get people back into the office is free alcohol. So that's what we've done. We make a day of it, right? To your point, we rarely expect people to be here before 10 a.m. anymore, for good reason, right? Because you are going to be sitting in traffic, even in little Nashville. And what's the point, right? Just what is the point anymore? So get your morning routine done, take your morning calls at home, do what you need to do, get in office, preferably before lunch, because we are doing a lot of, really nice, just fun relationship building lunches in office. And then when we have the executives in town, we will open up the break room, starting usually around 4:35 for just a little happy hour. And, what's funny is, pre-pandemic, getting access to have a drink with your C-suite, when did that happen? Right. I mean, but now you could do it at least once a week if you wanted to, if you want to come in. And we don't require it. We just sort of put it out there, and it's open to anybody. And I think it's been interesting to see the different audiences that we've gotten and what they want to talk about. But again, that's just one more way to kind of keep your ear to the ground. What are the threads of conversation that come up? And that's sort of a pact that we've made as a leadership team. Is it's really about checking in. It's really about keeping a pulse on our people. How are they doing? We've had some really horrible tragedies that we've all gone through, and every company has suffered through them. And so, people just need a lifeline at this point. Sometimes they just need an ear. They just need to know that they belong to something, and that can get lost in these fully distributed models if you let it. So we're spending a ton of time on that, and really helping coach and mentor our those that might need a little more self-discipline to be successful in this fully remote world. A couple of other points that I just want to touch on. So most of the reason we really did some dissection on why were we always in office? Well, a lot of it was again, that co-location with the client, but then it was also we've started really looking at our global models where we had second and third shifts to be able to have overlapping time with our customers. And I think that desire is still there from our clients, but the demand or the supply of people who are willing to do that has slowly diminished over this course of the pandemic. It's not as easy to work second and third shifts from home. It's very disruptive to the household. It's very disruptive to extended families, which a lot of our global regions have. And so it's done a couple of things. It's allowed us to really go back to the drawing board and work with Gartner and Everest and different to find out where is tech talent in US time zone outside of US, right? Like, where are the regions that have the most overlapping hours? And what are they good at? What are they mostly known for, right? And I can tell you, we look at nearshore both in Latin America, so that's Peru, Colombia, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil. And that's a very attractive location for us, LATAM, because of the empathy and the socialism, just the high level of social management, social skills, relationship management that culture brings when you're looking at patient consumable software, human-centric design-led engineering, which is what I focus on. Those are desired skill sets. But then we also have, our really complex data engineering, EMR solutioning, really hard, complicated technology stuff, which is really well known in Romania and Armenia and some, Belarus and over there where they are math and science. That's what they do, right? It's like the talent is immense. So it's really given us an opportunity to go beyond just your typical onshore, offshore, maybe dabble in nearshore, to where we're pretty much going all in now and really trying to find where the work can be done in the most natural time zone for the majority of the team members on the project. That's a completely different approach than we would have done in the past. But it's really exciting. And I think we're seeing the appreciation and just the engagement levels increase from our own teams. It's been really fun. So, all right, I know we got a few more minutes, so I'll stop.
That's awesome, Carmen. Thank you for that. So we do have about 5 or 6 minutes, and just FYI for those that this is the first time, we go as long as you guys want to stay. I know that there's some people that have a hard stop at 1, so feel free to bow out. Again, great having everyone. But I would love to hear from the audience some experiences that you've had during and post pandemic. What were some pivots you made? What were some challenges that you faced in doing so? So I'll open it up now, and I'd love to hear from 1 or 2 or more of you guys to speak to your guys' experience as well.
So this is David. I'm nowhere near Nashville. I'm in Houston, but we actually have quite the competition for the talent pool here in Houston because of the oil and gas industry. That's just a problem here in Houston. there's people who are highly paid, and then all of a sudden oil goes down, and then there's a lot of people looking for jobs. So we're constantly trying to hire people into our industry, which is financial industry. So it has worked out wonderfully because Houston traffic is much worse than Nashville's. I lived there for a year, but Houston traffic is terrible. So we're able to really be able to provide people the option to work remote. And that helped us for recruiting, just to say, you don't have to drive an hour and a half to get here, because it can take that long on a normal day to get from one side of the city to the other. And it really has saved a lot of people's nerves and time there. So we in order to try to facilitate the in-person piece, we have learned that the magic of food is wonderful. So we do have get-together lunches now that things have opened up, and we have plenty of restaurants to choose from to go gather and get together, and that helps so much. So and just in one funny observation, pre-pandemic, we were so focused on in-person work that we would actually cancel and move meetings if somebody was working remote that day. Like we literally would focus on that. It was so funny. But now it's so common for nobody to be in the office and everybody's remote, that we actually have found it to be more productive, that we allow for the remote people to always be participating. So for us, it's actually been kind of a net improvement to be more out of the office there like that. So that's just our take on it there. So
it sounds like, David, y'all are pretty much you're still hiring folks local, but you're not requiring them to stay in the office, but you're not hiring outside of the Houston area typically.
Yeah, typically, because our bank is located here in Houston. So we're in, I think, 17 states, but not Tennessee.
Yeah.
How odd is that? But it is kind of funny though that we can get people from other places. And during the pandemic, when we hired people who were 100% remote, they were, the first thing they did was check with us when things started opening up. They're like, I'm not going to have to relocate to Houston, am I?
Right.
So we have been able to increase the talent pool for searching, like you had said, Brian.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting. You talked about, meetings where some are remote and some are not. And I think Shawn alluded to this too. Like, some of the meetings can be difficult if you've got a contingent that's in person and a few that are remote. Can be a bad experience for the people that are remote, because the gravity of the room goes to the folks in person. One of the things that we intentionally did, we still have 3 or 4 people that go into the office until our lease is up in April. Because like Carmen said, some people just really like to be in an office around other people. And that's great. We're going to try to continue to accommodate that via co-working spaces and other ways. But we've established, like, look, if there are multiple people of you co-located and you're joining a meeting where some people are remote, treat it as a distributed first meeting. Everyone's joining it from their own laptop and a headset. So we have quiet rooms in our office that are for that. And that way you don't get into that weird pattern of, because it's awful. I did that for a year, a long time ago. I was the only remote employee of mostly co-located, and I could not stick it out. It was a very subpar experience.
And our actual office is a giant cube farm, and it is terrible to try to have everybody join from a cubicle.
I bet. Yeah.
And so I just love being remote in that sense, because I'm free to interact with my family when I can. I'm able to work with my coworkers, and I know the water cooled conversations are great. They can be very valuable at times, but I got to say, in a cubicle environment, the drive-bys from people are a little bit counterproductive sometimes. So it has been nice, because I no longer have drive-bys except through a Teams chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are self-discipline issues even in office, right? No doubt about it.
Very true. Very true.
Yeah, I think for our teams, thinking through one of that comparison of productivity on-site and off-site. I think we definitely experienced that there's a lot of individual productivity enhancement from being remote, because you have more heads down time. There aren't the interruptions. You can get in a groove and really focus in a way that is difficult, especially in a cube farm or an open type of setting. And one of the things that I've philosophically been brought in and found helpful is thinking about the difference between individual productivity and team productivity.
Mhm.
And so I know that I can be individually incredibly productive if I just put on noise canceling headphones and, hop into the text editor and just grind through. I can write really quickly a ton of code. It's a bunch of interesting things. The question that I have to ask myself, and I encourage my team to ask as well, is how much of that is on target? And I found that there tends to be kind of a relationship between the amount of time it's been since I last checked in with a customer and the amount of time I'm spending on my individual productivity. The longer I spend not checking in, the kind of more drift occurs, where I may be achieving a lot, but it may be more and more at a tangent to what the actual true north is. And so finding that balance of bringing time back in for the remote employees to go be with the customer, spend time with them, kind of get redirected and reoriented in the direction that they're headed, has been really helpful for us to be more productive, and then focusing our time when we're in person and together on that kind of reorienting activity, so that you don't end up with this amazing volume of productivity that's 15 degrees off center, but then you have to do work to bring it back in.
Make sure you're working on the right thing. Yeah,
exactly. That thought of like, yes, is this the right thing? Is this actually more productive? And I think that framing has been helpful too, because I think we've all had that experience of being really productive, being really proud, coming back in, showing people our work, and thinking, oh crap, it's not exactly what we needed. And then it's really painful to kind of bring it back in after the fact. But using that as a lens to look at the activity through of, is my individual productivity actually aligning to our group productivity goals? And what do I need to do next in order to be most aligned with that? Has brought some people willingly back into the office for meetings and interactions, because those are the resync points that actually make sure that we're moving in the right direction, or a remote meeting for that matter, and getting away from individual productivity, but back to, am I focused on the right things? And that's been a really helpful lens for us.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, and didn't get an opportunity earlier, can you briefly touch on what tools you might have tried, if any, for kind of the, you mentioned whiteboarding, and I'm in agreement that, in person is best, at least in my experience. There are some tools out there though that are helpful. Did you try any before you made the move to in person?
We played with a few for some of the like serendipitous things during the middle of the pandemic when nobody was in person. We did do like massive Teams meetings, and there's a feature where you can actually randomize breakout rooms, and that was a great experience. Really, we just said like, give me 4 people in a breakout room. 80 people showed up. Teams divided up, go, and we'd all break off and have time together for some of those serendipitous meetings. Very forced, but still was really useful, especially to meet with some of the remote staff who were never going to be in the office. I found that even just like on a screen sharing, there's a little power toy that Microsoft acquired years ago from sysinternals called Zoom It, and you can draw on your screen with just a right click, and that it's not 100% of the like the whiteboarding experience, but it's a darn good substitute. And especially if you have a tablet or a device with a pen where you can actually like scribble on top of a screen. I found that to be a really effective tool. I don't think it's been updated since 2008, but it works really well. And then also lets you zoom in on things, which I find can be helpful too, especially for a lot of us who, us techie types like our gigantic monitors with our huge screen resolutions. And when you go share those, everything gets so small for everyone else. Yeah. Okay, Carmen, your vision's probably where mine is. You're nodding in agreement. You're like, I can't read it. It's tiny. It's nice to have a tool that can kind of zoom in and focus on a particular part of the screen to kind of focus the conversation there. So that's been a super useful tool, and it's a free Microsoft download called Zoom It. That's been one that I keep coming back to. Or even if you're inside of the Microsoft world of having the pen and inking tools to be able to do in the middle of a PowerPoint presentation. Those can be super helpful as well, to just kind of draw it on screen. That there's something about making that experience somewhat tactile that seems to help, where you can say like, oh, this visualization needs to look a little bit different. We're going to pivot it this way. You can kind of scribble some bars and give it a label, and somehow that feels so much more real than just discussing it. That gives a kind of a sense of what the possibility is, so we can move on to discuss other things.
Yeah.
I'm curious if anyone else has had any luck with any tools. Just speaking for our team, we've used Miro, Miro, and it's a kind of virtual whiteboard that you can have multiple people collaborating on, and it's like you said, it's not the same, but it's pretty good. It works across devices, and yeah, anything like that others have tried and liked, I'd love to hear about it.
Miro is one that we have used quite often, and Smart Sheets, of course. I don't know if you use those or not, but so it kind of depends on, do we want to be graphical today, right, visual, or do we want to just get a task list hammered out? What does it look like? We tend to go between those two quite often.
I know another Microsoft-centric solution for anybody who's in that world is using Excel or PowerPoint or even Word in the shared environment where you have multiple editors. Editing a document together is a surprisingly good collaboration tool, especially when you're trying to put together task lists of things. It's I found that in PowerPoint to be really shockingly good canvases for collaboration on an idea.
We've been a Google shop for 10 years, and so we were using Google Documents for a long time prior. It is interesting. We've always had a hard time. Maybe not so much now, but the learning curve from like writing a document that's in a collaborative environment instead of emailing copies around final v7 docx, getting people out of that has proved challenging sometimes.
Yeah, those shared documents. Yeah, once you can break those old habits, can become really powerful, and doing it together instead of the emails back and forth, or forcing one person to be the scribe. It's finally gotten to be a good experience. I'm not sure when that happened, but sometime in the last 4 years, I think it's moved into like a completely usable experience to do the co-authoring in real time. And once people kind of get on board with it and get over the weirdness of seeing like, the orange box is me and the green box is this other person, it does work really well.
Very good. I appreciate that additional insight. We use Dribble some for, in addition to Miro, for kind of document compilation, kind of hub for some of our design projects. So that's another one. Dribble, I think it's Dribble with 3bs.com is a good one as well. Any other comments or stories or experiences that anyone else in the group has before we call it a day?
I'll put a question out there. Has anybody got an experience like that in a software IDE of being able to do some of those co-development things where we end up doing a fair bit of pair programming, especially with more junior developers, and it's taking control of somebody else's computer and typing in an IDE over them is a mediocre experience at best. And I've often thought that if there were some environment that did have a similar experience to one of those co-authoring tools for an IDE, that might be a really compelling experience.
Having worked with the software development team, we do a lot of mob programming, so there's multiple people programming, but typically we're not sharing control of the computer. You might have someone who's actually doing the presentation. We just use Google Meet and someone sharing their screen. The person typing, though, is not the one that's actually driving what's happening. So someone is talking through the process, which is a little different than a lot of pair programming. But there is a VS Code extension that some of our team has used to do kind of remote control development. We've tried a few different things. You're right, none of them are great. There's always like trade-offs. We even went so far as to set up a machine that everyone remoted into that was kind of shared for a while, and you could hand off control via some software. But even that was not, it didn't live long. I'll say that.
We've had good success with that, with VS Code, with the live share extension, which also works inside of Big Visual Studio as well too. And that has been really great when we have to do shared debugging sessions and all too. Like that works out really well. So
Definitely things I'll try. Thanks for the feedback.
Well, very good. Many thanks, Shawn, Carmen, and Brian, for taking the time to prep and to speak today. It was a very great session. So I'm looking forward to getting it touched up and putting it out on YouTube and LinkedIn for the rest of the world, Nashville, whoever sees our posts to view and get value from. Thank you all so much. So again, just to recap, let's touch base, follow TLN for what we have going on in 2022. There's not going to be any event in December. We had a holiday party a couple of years ago, and we're looking forward to possibly doing that again in 2022. But so I guess a good time to wish everyone a happy holidays. If there's anything myself or the group at TLN can do for any of you guys, let us know. And then look forward to picking things back up in January. Thank you all for joining. I hope you'll have a good rest of the day.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Take
thank
care.
you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, guys.